The wagon wheel splintered apart like a gunshot crack in the dead silence of the Arizona night, and Mae Harper's heart did the same. She stood in the darkness 40 miles from anywhere that mattered, her hands pressed over her mouth to keep the sob locked inside her chest where it could not escape and betray her. The night sky above the Sonoran desert blazed with stars that seemed to mock her with their indifferent brilliance. She had been running. She was always running, it seemed, and now the universe had decided she did not deserve even that small mercy. The left rear wheel of her wagon had caught on a jagged shelf of limestone buried beneath the red dust of the trail, and the force of it had shattered the spoke assembly clean through. The wagon listed hard to one side, and her entire life, everything she owned, everything she had managed to salvage from the wreckage of her marriage, and the scandal that had followed her out of Santa Fe, tilted with it, threatening to spill into the dark Arizona dirt. Mae Harper was 26 years old, and she was utterly alone. Not alone in the romantic sense that poets romanticized in Eastern drawing rooms. Alone in the raw, brutal, honest sense that meant no one would come if she screamed. Alone in the sense that meant she might not survive the night if she made the wrong choices in the next few minutes. This was 1884, and the Arizona Territory did not care about the difference between a woman of dignity and a woman of nothing. The land made no such distinctions. The land only cared whether you were strong enough or you were not. She forced herself to breathe. She forced herself to think. There was a ranch 2 miles back. She had passed it near sunset, had seen the warm amber glow of lamplight in the window, and looked away from it deliberately because warm lamplight in windows belonged to other people's lives. She had kept her horse, a stubborn bay mare she had named Prudence, moving at a steady walk despite the animal's protest, because stopping felt like surrender, and Mae Harper had run out of everything except the refusal to surrender. But Prudence could not pull a listing wagon with a shattered wheel. That was not a matter of stubbornness or pride. That was simply physics, and physics did not negotiate. Mae looked back down the dark trail. 2 miles. She unhitched Prudence from the wagon with practiced hands, looped the reins, and climbed onto the mare's bare back the way her father had taught her when she was 7 years old in Missouri. She did not take anything from the wagon. She told herself it would be fine. She told herself the dark shapes in the distant sagebrush were shadows and not the other things that moved through the Arizona night. She rode back to the ranch with her jaw set and her eyes forward. 6 weeks earlier, she had been Mae Aldridge, wife of Thomas Aldridge, respected merchant of Santa Fe, New Mexico. She had been the woman who arranged flowers on Sunday morning and kept the household accounts with meticulous precision and smiled at the appropriate moments during dinner parties. She had been performing the role of a life she had chosen at 19 because it had seemed solid and safe, and she had been performing it so long she had nearly forgotten there was a me underneath the performance. Then she had found the ledger. Not the household ledger she kept herself, but Thomas's other ledger, the one hidden beneath a false bottom in the lower left drawer of his mahogany desk. She had not been snooping. She had dropped a spool of thread that had rolled under the desk and lodged against that drawer when she pulled it open, and fate or providence or simple bad luck had arranged for her fingers to find the seam in the wood that revealed what Thomas had hidden. The ledger documented 7 years of systematic fraud. Thomas Aldridge had been collecting insurance payments on properties he claimed had burned or flooded or otherwise been destroyed, properties that in fact still stood and were still collecting rent under different names. He had been running this scheme since before their marriage. He had married her, she came to understand with a cold and nauseating clarity, partly because a respectable wife made a man look respectable, and a respectable man was less likely to be scrutinized. She had been his cover, his alibi, his proof of character. The betrayal of it sat in her chest like a stone that never warmed. She had confronted him. That had been her second mistake after marrying him in the first place. Thomas had been calm in a way that terrified her, had looked at her with those mild gray eyes and told her that she would say nothing, that she understood nothing about business, and that if she caused him difficulty, he would ensure everyone in Santa Fe understood that the ledger was in her handwriting, not his. He was very good at forgery, as it turned out. Mae had stood in that parlor with her hands clasped to keep them from shaking and understood that her only options were silence or escape. She had chosen escape. She had packed 2 trunks, hitched the wagon she had purchased with her own inheritance money before the marriage, taken Prudence, who was legally also hers, and left Santa Fe in the gray hour before dawn on a Wednesday in late September. She had told no one. She had left no note. She had a cousin in Tucson, a woman named Frances who had married a schoolteacher and lived a quiet, decent life, and she had pointed herself toward Frances like a compass needle pointing north. She had been making good time until the wheel found the limestone shelf. The ranch materialized out of the darkness as Prudence carried her back along the trail, first a dark smudge against the lesser darkness, then a shape, then a building, then a lit window with that warm amber glow she had deliberately looked away from 3 hours ago. The lamplight was still burning. Mae tied Prudence to the hitching post at the front gate with steady hands and walked to the door and knocked. The man who answered was not what she expected, though she could not have told you precisely what she expected. Perhaps a wizened old rancher, or a thick-necked hired hand with suspicious eyes. What she got was Calvin Whitfield, 32 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that meant he had spent his life doing actual physical labor rather than pretending to, with dark hair that was slightly too long and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes the color of the desert at twilight, that particular bruised blue-purple that happened in the last moments before full dark. He had been reading. She could see a book face down on the table behind him, which surprised her enough that she noted it even in the distress of the moment. He held a lantern and looked at her with those twilight eyes and did not say anything for a moment, just looked, and in that silence she felt the full weight of what she must appear to be, a woman alone at midnight, dusty and frightened and too proud to show the frightened part. "My wagon wheel broke," she said. "About 2 miles east. I need assistance." He studied her for another moment. "You are traveling alone?" "Yes." "At night?" The wheel did not wait for a more convenient hour. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but the ghost of one. "No," he said, "I suppose it did not. Come inside, please. I will put on coffee." She followed him into the kitchen because the alternative was standing in the dark, and she sat at the plain wooden table and accepted the coffee he poured and looked around at the interior of the ranch house. It was clean. Unexpectedly, deliberately clean, in the way that meant someone cared about it rather than just tolerating disorder. There were no decorative touches, no curtains or embroidery or the small female civilizing details she associated with proper homes, but the floor was swept, the dishes were stacked with military precision, and the book on the table was Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which was not what she expected a rancher in Arizona territory to be reading at midnight. "Calvin Whitfield," he said, sitting across from her with his own cup. "This is the Double W Ranch. I run cattle. You are?" "Mae Harper." The name came out easily, the name she had decided on during the first day of her journey, her mother's maiden name. Clean, simple, unconnected to Thomas Aldridge or Santa Fe or any of the dark history she was putting miles between herself and. "I am traveling to Tucson." "To family?" "Yes." He nodded as though this satisfied some internal question. "The wheel, you said, what damage?" "The entire spoke assembly. It shattered. I believe the rim may have come away from the hub as well, but I did not examine it closely." She paused. "In the dark." "Understandable." He looked at his coffee, then at her. "Are your belongings in the wagon?" "Yes." "The wagon is safe enough until morning. Animals are not bold enough to bother a whole wagon sitting in the road." "I know that," she said, and heard the edge in her own voice and softened it deliberately. "I appreciate the reassurance nonetheless. I am sorry to trouble you at this hour, Mr. Whitfield. If I could simply rest here until dawn, I will make arrangements in the morning." "You can take the spare room," he said immediately. "It was my brother's room. He is in Bisbee now working the mines. He does not mind." "I cannot impose. "You can and you will," he said, not unkindly. "It is 50 miles to Tucson, and you are traveling alone. There is nothing good waiting for a woman alone on that road at night, and I would not be able to sleep knowing I had turned you out into it." Mae looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching, without any of the calculating assessment she had learned to read in men's faces during 7 years of marriage to Thomas Aldridge. There was no hidden motive in Calvin Whitfield's face, just a straightforward decency that was so uncomplicated she almost did not recognize it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I will be gone before you wake." She meant it as she said it. She truly did. She was wrong about several things that night. The most significant of them was the idea that she would be able to simply leave. She did not sleep well in the spare room, which smelled of pine soap and old hay, and the specific masculine scent of a young man who had lived there without female influence, pleasant in the way clean things are pleasant. She lay on the narrow bed with her eyes open and listened to the Arizona night beyond the window, the distant call of a great horned owl, the dry whisper of wind through the sagebrush, the occasional creak of the house settling on its foundation, and she thought about the wagon. She thought about what it would cost to have the wheel repaired at a proper wheelwright. She thought about how much money she had in the tin box hidden in the false bottom of her second trunk, which she had designed herself after discovering how much men depended on women not knowing how to hide things. She did enough arithmetic to determine that she could afford the repair, but that it would leave her thin on funds for the remainder of the journey, and she lay there in the pre-dawn dark and felt the familiar tightening of anxiety that had lived in her chest since the Wednesday morning she had driven away from her Santa Fe house. Around 4 in the morning she heard something. Sounds from outside, careful sounds, the kind made by someone trying not to make sounds. Mae sat up immediately, her heart hammering because in her current circumstances any unexpected sound required assessment. She crossed to the window and looked out. Calvin Whitfield was in the yard. He had not gone back to bed. Or if he had risen before 3 in the morning. He was dressed in his work clothes, lantern hung on a nail in the fence post, and he was loading the bed of his own small ranch wagon with tools. She recognized the shape of a wheelwright's brace and bit, a mallet, a spoke wrench, iron wedges. He was moving with the quiet economy of a man who had made a decision and was simply executing it without drama or ceremony. She watched him drive the ranch wagon out of the yard in the direction of the eastern trail. She stood at the window and felt something shift in her chest, something she did not have a word for in the moment, something that was not quite gratitude and not quite surprise and was in fact much larger and more frightening than either. He was going to fix her wagon, in the middle of the night, before dawn, without being asked, without expecting her to know. Mae Harper pressed her fingertips against the cold glass of the window and breathed very carefully. She had known Thomas Aldridge for 3 months before she married him. She had believed she understood the shape of him. She had been catastrophically wrong, and here was a man she had known for perhaps 2 hours who was driving alone in the dark to repair a stranger's broken wagon, and she found herself in the terrifying position of not knowing what to do with that. She could go back to bed. That was the sensible thing. She could go back to bed and sleep, and in the morning pretend she had not seen him leave, could thank him for the room and the coffee and be on her way to Tucson with her wagon repaired, and that would be the end of it, a kindness given and received, and the world moving on as it tended to. She made her decision in approximately 30 seconds. She dressed, braided her dark hair into a hasty plait and went to find him. Prudence was still tied at the front gate. Mae untied the mare, climbed up and followed the trail east. She found him kneeling in the red dirt beside her listing wagon, his lantern set close, his hands already deep in the broken wheel assembly. He had wedged the wagon bed up with a length of timber to take the weight off the damaged corner, and he was working with the focused concentration of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He did not hear her approach over the sound of his own work, or if he heard Prudence's soft hooves in the dust, he did not look up. Me dismounted and watched him for a full minute before she spoke. "You should have woken me," she said. He looked up then. Something crossed his face quickly, something she might almost call embarrassment, the expression of a man caught doing something he had not intended to be witnessed. It was there and gone before she could fully read it. "Wheel repair is straightforward," he said. "You did not need to be here for it." Nevertheless, she tied Prudence to the wagon's side rail and crouched down beside him to look at the damage. "The hub is still sound." He glanced at her with brief surprise that she would know to ask about the hub. "Hub is fine. The spoke assembly is a total loss, but I brought spares. My ranch wagon takes the same size wheel." He gestured to the parts laid out on the ground beside him. "I will have it done before sunrise. I can help." "You do not need to, Mr. Whitfield," she said quietly. "You drove out here in the middle of the night to repair a broken wheel for a woman you met 2 hours ago. The least you can allow me is to hand you your tools." He looked at her for a moment. That ghost of a smile again, fuller this time. "All right," he said. "Hand me the spoke wrench, the long one." They worked side by side in the circle of lantern light while the Arizona darkness breathed around them. Me handed tools when he asked for them, held the lantern when he needed both hands, watched his technique with the focused attention she had always applied to learning things, because learning things was one of the activities that had remained genuinely hers even inside the performance of her marriage. Calvin Whitfield was very good with his hands. Not in the showy way that performed competence to impress onlookers, but in the quiet, matter-of-fact way of genuine expertise, the way her father had been good with horses, knowing instinctively how much pressure to apply, and when, where the leverage was, what the material needed. She found herself watching his hands as much as the wheel, the way the lantern light moved across his knuckles and the tendons of his forearms. "Stop at me," she told herself firmly. "You have done this before," she said. Conversation was safer than watching. "Wheels break regularly out here," he said. "You learn fast or you are stranded regularly. You have been on this land long. 8 years. He worked the new spoke into the hub with careful force. "I came from Texas in '76. I was 24. The land here was cheaper and there was water if you knew where to find it. You knew where to find it. I learned." A pause. From a Tohono O'odham elder named Alejandro who thought it was the funniest thing he had ever seen, a Texas boy wandering around in the desert looking confused. "He took pity on me eventually." Me smiled despite herself. "That was generous of him. I did some work for his community in exchange, put up a fence line, helped repair a building. It seemed fair." Calvin looked up briefly from the wheel. "What about you? You are from New Mexico." The question was casual, but me felt its weight. She had constructed Mae Harper with some care during those first days on the road, had decided what was true and what she would keep private, had understood that she could not lie about everything because lies required maintenance, and she was tired in a way that did not have patience for elaborate construction. "Originally from Missouri," she said. "I spent several years in Santa Fe. I have a cousin in Tucson I am going to visit." All technically true. The spaces between the truths were vast and dark, but she had not lied. "Missouri," he said. "You came out on the trail. I have been traveling 6 days." She handed him the mallet without being asked, anticipating the need correctly, and saw from the slight change in his expression that he had noticed. "I am a reasonable driver. The limestone caught me off guard." "It catches everyone off guard," he said. "There is a particular shelf about 2 miles from my property line that has broken 3 wheels that I know of, including one of mine." He placed the mallet blow with precision and the new spoke seated firmly. "I have been meaning to mark it. I keep forgetting." "Mark it after today," she suggested. "I will." He reached for the rim iron without looking, his hand moving to where her hand was already holding it out to him, and their fingers touched. It was the most mundane thing in the world, one person handing a tool to another in the dark, and the contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds before he took the rim iron and she withdrew her hand. But something in Me's chest did that alarming shifting thing again, more pronounced this time, like a door that had been sealed shut for a very long time suddenly admitting a thread of light at its edge. She said nothing. He said nothing. The desert breathed around them. He finished the repair as the eastern sky was beginning its slow conversation from black to indigo to the first pale suggestion of gray. The work was clean and solid, the new wheel as sound as anything produced in a proper wheelwright's shop, perhaps more so because he had seated every spoke with the particular care of a man who knew that someone's life might depend on its holding. Calvin stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at the wagon with the assessing eye of a craftsman reviewing his work. "That will hold to Tucson and back," he said. "It is beautiful work," Mae said honestly. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. I am deeply in your debt." "No debt," he said immediately. "It cost me a few hours of sleep and some spare parts I can replace." She looked at him in the growing gray light. The stars were fading. The owl had gone quiet. Far to the east, somewhere beyond the rocky ridges, a mockingbird began its elaborate rehearsal of other birds' songs. "Why?" she asked. It came out more directly than she had intended, but she let it stand because she genuinely wanted to know. "Why did you do it? You could have simply given me the room and let me sort out the wheel in the morning. That would have been more than sufficient." Calvin was quiet for a moment, looking at the eastern horizon rather than at her. His profile in the gray dawn light was strong and still, the kind of face that looked like it had been tested and had not broken. "My mother came west on her own when she was 22, he said finally. "Texas, back when Texas was still as rough as this. She had a broken axle on the road to Abilene and 3 men passed her by without stopping. The 4th one stopped and helped her and later married her, and that was my father." He paused. "He used to say that the men who pass by are not wicked mostly. They are just in a hurry. He said he hoped he would never be too much in a hurry." Mae felt the back of her throat tighten. "I am glad the 4th man stopped," she said. Calvin looked at her then, those twilight eyes steady in the morning light. "So am I," he said. "Every day." He hitched Prudence back to the wagon with the ease of long practice, checked the traces, checked the wheel one final time with his palm flat against the hub. Mae stood nearby and tried to get her equilibrium back, tried to remember the plan, tried to remember that she was Mae Harper going to Tucson to visit her cousin Frances, and that Calvin Whitfield was simply a kind stranger who would now be behind her on the road. "There is coffee and biscuits at the house," he said. "You are welcome to breakfast before you go." She should have said no. She said yes. She told herself later, many times, that it was only practical. She had a 50-mile journey ahead, and she had eaten little the day before, and breakfast was simply fuel. She maintained this fiction for perhaps 3 days after she left the Double W Ranch, and then she stopped bothering with it because, even inside her own head, she was a poor liar. The truth was that she wanted to sit across the table from Calvin Whitfield for a little longer. The truth was that the kitchen, with its precise cleanliness, and its Darwin on the table, and its man who drove out before dawn to fix strangers' wagons, felt more like a home than her Santa Fe house had felt in years. The truth was terrifying, and she treated it with appropriate caution. They sat across from each other in the morning light that poured through the east-facing kitchen window, and ate the biscuits he had clearly prepared earlier and been keeping warm, which meant he had planned on feeding her before she drove away, had assumed she would leave without eating because that was the efficient thing, and had made sure she would have something warm regardless. She drank the coffee and ate the biscuit with butter and a spoonful of dark honey and tried not to think too carefully about how much she did not want to leave. "What do you raise?" she asked. "On the ranch. Cattle primarily. I have been experimenting with a mixed herd, some Herefords crossed with Longhorns, trying to get animals that can handle the desert heat but put on more weight. The Longhorns are tough as iron but lean as rails." He poured more coffee without asking if she wanted it, correctly reading her empty cup. "I have 37 head currently. I want to build to 100 before I start thinking about expansion." "What is your acreage?" He looked at her again with that subtle surprise. 640. I bought the original homestead claim and then added the adjacent section 2 years ago. A slight pause. You know something about ranching. My father had cattle in Missouri. Not on this scale, but enough. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. I spent my childhood knowing the difference between a Hereford and an Angus, which is not information that proved useful in Santa Fe. It might prove useful again. The words were simple enough. The way he said them was simple enough. But me heard something underneath them, something that might have been an invitation if she looked at it from the right angle, and she made herself look away from it because she was not in a position to accept invitations. She had a husband. Somewhere behind her in Santa Fe, she still technically had a husband. That was not the kind of problem that resolved itself by ignoring it, and until it was resolved, she was not a free woman in any meaningful sense. She had not yet thought carefully about what resolving it would require. She had been focused on the immediate business of surviving the road. "You are very quiet suddenly," Calvin said. "I was thinking," she said, "about the road ahead." He nodded, accepting this, not pushing. Another point in his favor, she thought. Men who pushed were a particular type of dangerous she had become expert at recognizing. She left an hour after sunrise. She helped him wash the 2 cups and the plate from breakfast, which he accepted without comment, and then she took her bonnet from the hook by the door and picked up her gloves and turned to face him in the morning light, and said everything that needed to be said in ordinary words. "Thank you for the room and the coffee and the biscuits and the wheel," she said. "I hope your 37 head of cattle become 100 soon, and then 1,000 after that." He smiled properly for the first time, a full real smile that changed the whole geometry of his face in a way that made her feel faintly dizzy, and said, "Safe travels, Miss Harper. Give my regards to Tucson." She drove away without looking back. She made it perhaps 300 yards down the eastern trail before she looked back. He was still standing in the doorway. She could not read his expression at that distance, but he raised one hand briefly. She turned forward and urged Prudence to a walk and told herself firmly that she was Mae Harper going to Tucson, and that was the beginning and end of her story at this particular moment. Frances was delighted to see her. Frances was a warm, practical woman of 30 who had navigated her own difficult history, had married her schoolteacher husband Jacob at 22, had 2 boys aged 6 and 3, and ran her household with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had chosen her life deliberately and was satisfied with the choice. She asked no uncomfortable questions when Mae arrived on her doorstep. She simply took one look at Mae's face and said, "You need a bath, a meal, and about a week of sleep, and then you will tell me whatever you want to tell me and nothing you do not." Mae wept for the first time in the spare room of Frances's house, quietly and thoroughly, without quite knowing whether she was crying about Thomas or the wagon wheel or the twilight-eyed rancher who had fixed it in the dark. And perhaps it did not matter because they were all parts of the same larger loss and the same larger question about what her life was supposed to be. She stayed in Tucson for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks she saw a lawyer, a young man named George Hensley who had been practicing in Arizona territory for 5 years, and who listened to her situation with careful attention, and said, with a directness she appreciated, that her options for a legal separation from Thomas Aldridge were limited but not non-existent. In the territory of Arizona in 1884, a woman could petition for divorce on grounds of desertion or extreme cruelty. The fraud was not precisely ground for divorce, but the circumstances of her departure and Thomas's threat might constitute cruelty if documented carefully. "It will take time," George Hensley said. "And Thomas Aldridge will have to be formally served, which means he will know where you are." "He already knows where I am going," Mae said. "I told him I had family in Tucson. He did not think I would actually leave." She looked at the paper on Hensley's desk. "Begin the process." She paid him from the tin box, which was thinner than she liked, and drove herself back to Frances's house, and sat on the porch in the Tucson evening, and watched the desert go gold and copper in the late light and thought about practical matters. She could not stay with Francis indefinitely. Francis and Jacob had welcomed her with genuine warmth and had not said a word about the imposition, but Mae had not been raised to be a burden on people she loved. She needed employment. She needed income. She needed a plan. The teachers' college in Tucson was not hiring. The mercantile already had its accounts managed by the owner's wife. The hotel had a position for a laundress, which Mae took without pride and held for 1 week before her hands were so damaged by the lye soap and hot water that Francis made her stop. "You are educated," Francis said firmly, on the evening of the 7th day, examining Mae's cracked and reddened hands with genuine distress. "You read Latin, for heaven's sake. There has to be something better than laundry." "Latin is not particularly useful currency in Arizona territory," Mae said. "You kept accounts. You said Thomas's operation ran smoothly because of your accounting." "I will not go back to accounting for a man who," she stopped. "I am sorry. That is not what you meant." "Obviously not." Francis sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "There is a gentleman in the territory who has been advertising for a land manager. His name is— I am not interested in working for a man in a remote location with no other women around," Mae said flatly. "Not at this time." Francis nodded, understanding perfectly. Then what? Mae thought. She thought about the 640 acres of the Double W Ranch, and the man who wanted 37 head to become 100, and the fact that she had grown up knowing cattle and had 7 years of meticulous financial record-keeping experience, and had a driving, specific, personal motivation to not be dependent on anyone's charity. She thought about these things and tried very hard not to connect them in the obvious way. She failed. "I may," she said carefully, "know someone who needs help with accounts and operations management. A rancher. I met him briefly on the road." Francis watched her with the particular expression of a woman who sees more than she is being told. "Briefly," she said, "very briefly. And you know he needs help with accounts. I know he has 37 head of cattle, 640 acres, and is managing everything himself. That is a workload that exceeds one person's capacity." Francis continued to watch her. "Is he a decent man?" Mae thought about a man driving out in the dark with a lantern and a box of tools. "I believe so," she said. "Yes." She wrote a letter to Calvin Whitfield at the Double W Ranch, care of the Benson Post Office, which was the nearest postal point to his property. She kept the letter formal and businesslike, explained her qualifications, proposed specific terms, and asked plainly whether he had need of a ranch accountant and operations assistant who could also take on some light management duties in exchange for room, board, and a modest wage. She sealed it and sent it with Francis's boy who rode to the post office on Wednesday mornings. She did not sleep well for the 4 days it took to receive a reply. The reply was a single page, written in a plain, strong hand. "Miss Harper, your proposal interests me. I do not have a guest room to offer as the arrangement is less temporary than your previous stay, but I have a bunkhouse that is currently unoccupied and which I can make habitable. The work you describe would be useful. Come when you are ready. Calvin Whitfield." Mae read the letter 3 times. She read the word useful and thought that she had never in her life wanted so badly to be useful to one specific person. She was at the Double W in 5 days. The bunkhouse, as Calvin had promised, was habitable, more than habitable. He had cleaned it, replaced 2 boards on the floor that had been soft, installed a new lock on the door, and put a small wood stove in the corner that had not been there before. She found a small bunch of dried desert wildflowers on the windowsill, which she suspected had been placed there by some instinct that surprised him as much as it would surprise her, because there was nothing else in the room that was decorative, and they looked slightly self-conscious sitting there among the utilitarian furnishings. She did not mention the flowers. She put her trunk under the bed and hung her 2 good dresses on the hook behind the door and arranged the tin box in the back of the single shelf above the small writing table. She began work the following morning. Calvin's records were, as she had suspected, functional but chaotic. He kept receipts in an old coffee tin, tracked cattle numbers in a notebook that mixed livestock records with personal notes and what appeared to be a grocery list from 8 months ago, and had a system for tracking his water usage that made sense only to him. Mae spent 3 days simply organizing before she could begin proper analysis. On the 4th day, she found the problem. It was not fraud, nothing like that. Calvin Whitfield was scrupulously honest. She could see that immediately in the records. But he was underselling his beef to the Benson broker at a price that was below the current market rate, and had been for 2 years, simply because he had not had time to research current prices, and the broker, a man named Pickett, was not volunteering the information. He was leaving nearly 30% of his potential income on the table. She knocked on the kitchen door of the main house that evening with her numbers written out on a clean sheet of paper. Calvin read them in silence. Then he looked up at her. "Pickett has been taking advantage of your limited information." "Yes," she said. "I would not call it theft. He offered you a price you accepted, but the Tucson buyers are paying 30% higher and the El Paso market is another 15 above that." "I do not have the contacts in Tucson," Calvin said. "I do," Mae said. "Or rather, Frances does, and she will introduce me, and through me she will introduce you." She paused. "If you agree." He looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you known this?" "I found it today, and you brought it to me today." "Of course." Something in his expression shifted in a way she was beginning to learn the shape of. A particular quality of stillness that meant he was feeling something more than he was showing. "All right," he said. "Yes. Make the contact with Tucson." She made the contact. Within 3 weeks she had negotiated a direct sale to a Tucson buyer for Calvin's next drive, at a price that made the broker Pickett's offer look insulting by comparison. Calvin drove 20 head to Tucson in early November and came back with nearly double what he had received from Pickett for a similar sale the previous year. He came to the bunkhouse door when he returned, which he had never done before. He always waited for her to come to him. "I brought you something," he said, and held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, women's size, excellent quality, lined with rabbit fur. "For the winter. Your hands looked cold this morning." Mae looked at the gloves. She thought about the flowers on the windowsill. "Thank you," she said carefully. "It is November in the desert," he said, which was technically a statement of fact and technically not an expression of feeling, and they both knew it was both. She wore the gloves every morning after that. December came with cold nights and clear, bright days, and the particular austere beauty of the Sonoran Desert in winter, the saguaros standing in their dignified thousands against a sky of impossible blue. Mae had been at the Double W for 6 weeks, and had established a rhythm that suited her more than anything had suited her in a long time. She rose before Calvin most mornings, started the kitchen stove, had coffee ready when he came in from the first morning check of the herd. She kept the accounts with the precision that was her nature, wrote letters to the Tucson buyer and to other potential contacts, drafted a 3-year plan for growing the herd to 200 head that Calvin read with an expression of suppressed excitement. He was clearly trying to moderate with appropriate skepticism. They ate dinner together most evenings. They talked about the cattle, about the land, about the water rights that Calvin had been quietly building a case to secure, about the territorial politics that affected range access, about books. He had a small collection, Darwin already mentioned, and also a battered copy of Great Expectations, and a botanical survey of the Sonoran Desert that he had been working through since he bought it 4 years ago and was still not finished with. Mae had brought 2 books from Santa Fe, Jane Austen's Persuasion, which felt grimly appropriate, and a mathematics text that she used to maintain her calculation skills. She and Calvin began exchanging books without either of them making a formal announcement that this was happening. She found herself looking forward to dinner in a way that had nothing to do with food. One evening in mid-December, she was working at the small writing table in the bunkhouse by lamplight when she heard Calvin on the path outside. his familiar footstep with its slight favoring of the left, the result of a break that had healed imperfectly when he was 19. He had told her once during dinner, a fall from a horse in Texas that had put him in bed for 6 weeks. He knocked on the bunkhouse door. She said, "Come in." He came in with a letter in his hand. "This came for you today in Benson," he said. "I picked up mail when I was in for supplies." She took the letter and looked at the return address and felt her stomach drop to the floorboards. Thomas Aldridge. Santa Fe, New Mexico. She had known this was coming. George Hensley had warned her. Thomas would be served, would respond. She had known, but knowing it intellectually and holding the physical evidence of it were different countries. "Bad news?" Calvin asked quietly. She looked up. His face was careful and neutral in the way she had learned meant he was controlling a stronger reaction. "Not unexpected news," she said. She did not open the letter while he was there. "I should read this privately." "Of course." He did not move immediately. He stood for a moment looking at her with those twilight eyes and said, very quietly, "Whatever it is, you are not alone in it." She held those words in her chest for a long time after he left. The letter from Thomas was 3 pages of precisely calibrated threat. He was not going to grant a divorce. He was prepared to contest any petition on grounds that Mae had abandoned the marital home. He had witnesses who would testify to her instability. He had documentation, fake documentation, she knew, but documentation that would look real to a court, that the ledger she had found was her own work and not his. He would ruin her reputation completely and permanently if she did not return within 60 days. He called her foolish. He called her ungrateful. He said she had no idea what she was doing to herself. Mae read the letter twice, folded it precisely, and put it in the tin box with her financial documents. Then she went to the main house, knocked on the kitchen door, and said, "May I have some of that coffee, please?" Calvin poured without asking any questions. They sat at the kitchen table, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything for a while, and then Mae took a breath and told him. Not everything, not Thomas's specific crimes, but enough. She told him about the fraud, about the threat, about leaving, about the divorce petition and the counter-threat in the letter. She watched Calvin's face during the telling and saw it go very still, the particular stillness that in his case she had learned indicated the strongest feelings. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He is threatening you with false evidence," Calvin said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Does your attorney know the full extent of the fraud?" "Hensley knows about the ledger, yes." "If Aldridge commits fraud against you in a court proceeding, it compounds his existing crimes significantly." "Has Hensley spoken to anyone in the federal prosecutor's office?" Mae blinked. She had not considered this angle. "I do not know." "Arizona territory is federal jurisdiction," Calvin said, with the focused precision of a man who had spent years dealing with federal land claims and water rights. "The insurance fraud crosses state lines, which makes it a federal matter. If Hensley is only approaching this as a domestic case, he may be missing a much larger lever." Mae sat with this. She turned it over and examined it from several angles. "You have thought about this kind of thing before," she said. "I have had my own legal battles over water rights," he said. "Not the same thing, but I have learned that the jurisdiction matters enormously." He met her eyes. "May I write to someone on your behalf?" "A man I know in Tucson who has contacts with the federal courts. He helped me with my water claim." She looked at him. The lamplight was warm on his face. Outside, the December desert had gone fully cold and dark, and the kitchen was the warmest place in the world. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It came out the same way as the first time, that night by the broken wagon, the same genuine need to understand. Calvin set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Because you deserve better than what that man did to you," he said. "And because," he stopped, looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. "Because I have been trying very hard to behave appropriately given your circumstances, and part of that is making sure your circumstances change." The silence in the kitchen was very full of something unspoken. Mae felt the thread of light at the edge of that sealed door become something wider, something she could no longer pretend was not there. "Calvin," she said softly. "No," he said. Not yet, not while you are still married, but I want, he exhaled. I want you to know that there is a reason I am invested in your situation that is not purely humanitarian. The honesty of it was almost more than she could hold. She had lived with careful dishonesty for so long that straightforward declaration felt foreign and overwhelming. Write your letter, she said, to the man in Tucson. He wrote the letter. His contact in Tucson was a former territorial marshal named Jim Cartwright who had turned to law and had significant connections with the federal prosecutor's office. Jim Cartwright read Calvin's letter, met with George Hensley, and within 2 weeks had arranged a meeting between Hensley and a federal prosecutor, who was very interested indeed in a case of multi-state insurance fraud involving forged documentation and a pattern of operations spanning 7 years. The investigation of Thomas Aldridge began in January of 1885. Mae did not return to Santa Fe for any of it. She did not need to. Hensley managed the legal proceedings, federal investigators managed the evidence collection, and Thomas Aldridge managed, ultimately, to make things significantly worse for himself by attempting to bribe one of the federal investigators, which was the kind of reckless decision that men made when they could not believe their carefully constructed world was genuinely collapsing. Mae received letters from Hensley every 2 weeks, careful legal summaries of developments. She read them at the writing table in the bunkhouse, and then filed them in a separate envelope from Thomas's threatening letter, which she had decided to keep as potential evidence. She did not think about Thomas Aldridge more than necessary. She thought about the double W, she thought about the plan for the herd. She thought, more than she meant to, about the man in the main house who was behaving with extraordinary restraint and extraordinary care, whose feelings she knew now with precision, and whose restraint she both respected and found quietly maddening. On a clear January afternoon she was riding the eastern fence line on Prudence, checking for breaks in the wire, when Calvin rode up beside her on his gray gelding Duke. "There is a section down near the wash," he said. "I saw it this morning. I know, I am going to it now." She showed him the fencing pliers hanging from her saddle horn. "I came prepared." He fell in beside her without asking. They rode parallel along the fence in companionable silence, the winter sun low in the south, the saguaros casting long, thin shadows on the pale ground. "The Tucson buyer has expressed interest in a contract for the spring drive," Mae said. "I have been drafting terms. I want to review them with you this evening." "Of course." Another silence. The horses moved steadily. A roadrunner crossed the path ahead of them with its specific urgent absurdity, and both Mae and Calvin laughed at the same moment, which had been happening with increasing frequency, this simultaneous recognition of the same small comedy. "I heard from Hensley yesterday," she said. "I know, I saw the letter in the mail. The federal investigation has expanded. Thomas's partner in the scheme, a man named Delaney, has agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges." She kept her eyes on the fence line. "Hensley says the case against Thomas is becoming very strong. And the divorce petition. He says it may be resolved in conjunction with the criminal proceedings. If Thomas is convicted, his ability to contest anything in civil court becomes significantly complicated." She could feel Calvin looking at her from her peripheral vision. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Not the legal mechanics. You." Mae was quiet for a moment. A cactus wren somewhere in the scrub was conducting a heated argument with itself. "Relieved," she said finally, "and sad. Not for Thomas specifically, but for the version of the future I believed I was building when I married him. That is the thing you mourn, I think, not the person but the future you thought you had." She glanced at Calvin. "Does that make sense?" "Complete sense," he said quietly. They reached the downed fence section and dismounted, and Calvin held the wire while Mae worked the pliers, because her hands had more precision for the fine work, and they fixed it together in the same natural collaboration they had developed for everything at the ranch, the division of labor that arose from observing what each person did best rather than from any system of command. When the fence was repaired, Calvin did not immediately remount. He stood with his hand on Duke's bridle and looked at the desert, the long view south toward Mexico, and me stood nearby and felt the air between them full of things being held in careful suspension. "I want to ask you something," Calvin said. He was still looking south. "And I want you to understand that I am asking, not assuming or expecting. You may say no without any change in our arrangement here." "Ask," me said. He looked at her then. "When your situation is resolved, when it is properly, legally finished, would you consider the possibility of," he stopped, tried again, "would you be willing to let me court you properly? Not in secret, not informally, but in the full and recognized manner, with the intention of another stop. Marriage?" me asked. "Yes," he said, simply, "that." Mae Harper stood in the January desert and felt the door that had been sealed for so long open fully, light pouring through it in a way that was both terrifying and the most natural thing that had ever happened to her. "Yes," she said, "when it is properly finished. Yes." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen before, open and unguarded in a way that made him look younger, made him look like the 24-year-old who had come from Texas with more courage than certainty, and had asked a Tohono O'odham elder to teach him where the water was. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They rode back to the ranch in the long golden light of the January afternoon, and nothing was the same as it had been that morning, and both of them understood this perfectly. Spring came to the Sonoran Desert in the particular extravagant way of that place and season, the brittle bush blazing yellow across the hillsides, the saguaro beginning their slow production of waxy white flowers, the air changing from the crystal sharpness of winter to something warmer and more complex. Me had been at the Double W for 5 months. The herd had grown to 49 head, the spring drive contract with the Tucson buyer was signed, and George Hensley had sent a letter in March that Me had read 3 times standing in the middle of the bunkhouse before she could quite accept what it said. Thomas Aldridge had pled guilty. Not to all charges, but to the significant ones, the core insurance fraud that the federal prosecutors had built most carefully. In exchange for his plea, the 7 additional counts relating to the forged ledger and the threat against Me had been included as part of the sentencing recommendation. He was going to federal prison. The sentence was 12 to 15 years. The civil divorce, Hensley wrote, would proceed as an uncontested matter now that Thomas was no longer in a position to contest anything. It would be finalized within 60 days. Me sat on the bunkhouse steps in the late afternoon light with the letter in her hands. In 60 days, she would be free. The feeling was not triumph. It was not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It was more like the feeling after a very long, difficult journey, not the joy of arrival exactly, but the specific wonder of suddenly not having to keep going, of being able to stop and look around and discover where you actually were. She was at the Double W Ranch in Arizona territory. She was exactly where she wanted to be. Calvin came around the corner of the main house with a bucket and saw her on the steps with the letter and read her expression, because he had spent 5 months learning to read her expressions with considerable accuracy. He set the bucket down and came and sat beside her on the steps, close enough that their arms touched, which was the appropriate boundary they had been maintaining with careful discipline since January. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. The quality of his stillness became something else, something that was trying very hard to be controlled and was perhaps not entirely succeeding. He handed the letter back. 60 days, he said. Yes, he exhaled slowly. Then I had better be patient for 60 more days. Me laughed, sudden and genuine, the kind of laugh that surprised her by existing. You have been patient for 5 months. I have had excellent motivation to continue. She looked at him. The bunkhouse steps were warm in the late afternoon sun, and the desert smelled of brittlebush and warming earth, and Calvin Whitfield was looking at her with those twilight eyes in a way that made the concept of 60 days feel simultaneously manageable and completely impossible. "Tell me something about the ranch," she said. "Something that needs doing. Something practical. The south pasture fence needs new posts, he said immediately. The old ones are rotting at the base. We can start that tomorrow, she said. He nodded. Tomorrow, he agreed. They sat on the steps in the warm spring light, and it was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, which was, Mae was beginning to understand, the actual texture of a life built in partnership. Not constantly dramatic, not the performed happiness of a Santa Fe dinner party. Real, particular, theirs. The 60 days passed. They passed in the specific way of busy days, with the south pasture fence posts replaced, the spring drive successfully completed, a new section of the water system improved with a suggestion Mae had from reading the Territorial Water Rights Survey, a letter from Calvin's brother in Bisbee who was coming to visit in summer, and a second letter from Hensley confirming the finalization date. On the morning of the day that George Hensley's final letter arrived confirming the divorce was complete and legal and binding, Calvin was not at the main house when Mae knocked on the kitchen door. She found a note on the table. Gone to check the north herd. Back by noon. Mae put the letter on the table where he would see it, poured herself coffee from the still warm pot on the stove, and sat down to wait. He was back at 11:30. She heard Duke's hooves in the yard, heard Calvin's boots on the porch, heard the door. He saw the letter. He saw her face. He picked up the letter and read it standing at the door without taking his hat off or setting down the gloves in his hand. When he finished, he looked at her. He set the letter down and set the gloves down and crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her face in both his hands, carefully, as though she might be something fragile, though she was very much not fragile, and looked at her for one moment with everything he had been holding for 5 months visible in his face, and then he kissed her. It was not a timid kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been patient for precisely the correct amount of time, and had no further intention of continuing to exercise that particular restraint. Mae's hands came up and gripped the front of his shirt, and the letter was on the table, and the coffee was getting cold, and the desert outside was going about its brilliant, ordinary business, and none of that mattered. When they finally separated, Mae had her forehead pressed against his and her hands still in his shirt, and his hands were still framing her face, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," Calvin said, a little unsteadily. "Yes," Mae said, equally so. He laughed. She felt it against her forehead before she heard it. Then she laughed too. Then he kissed her again briefly and perfectly, and stepped back and looked at her with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that she had to look away from it because it made her eyes sting. "I would like to ask you something properly," he said. His voice had steadied. He was Calvin Whitfield again, direct and unaffected, with just the trace of something warm and new underneath. Formally, with appropriate ceremony. "You could," she allowed. He took her hand. She let him, feeling his calloused palm against hers, the hands that had fixed her wagon in the dark, that had built and repaired and maintained this piece of the desert with 8 years of genuine work. "Mae Harper," he said, "would you marry me? With full and clear understanding that I am offering you partnership in every sense I know how to mean that word. Not the kind of marriage you have escaped from, something entirely different." She looked at him. This man with his Darwin on the table and his 37 head of cattle and his mother's story about the 4th man who stopped, and his way of driving out before dawn with a lantern and a box of tools to help a stranger who needed it. "Yes," she said. "Calvin, yes." They were married in August of 1885, in the parlor of Francis and Jacob's house in Tucson, because Francis absolutely refused to allow the ceremony to happen without her, and because the schoolteacher Jacob was a calm and decent man who accepted Calvin with the simple judgment of someone who had watched Mae be genuinely happy for the first time and approved of the cause. Calvin's brother, a younger and louder version named Daniel who had come from Bisbee for the summer, stood as witness. Jim Cartwright, the former marshal who had connected them to the federal case, attended as a guest and told Calvin afterward that marrying the woman who reorganized your cattle operation was the most sensible thing he had ever heard of. The ceremony was not elaborate. Mae wore her best dress, a blue wool that she had always loved more than the Santa Fe dinner dresses she had been expected to wear. Calvin wore his good coat, which was clean and pressed, and did not quite fit his shoulders because it had been made before he had fully developed the build that 8 years of ranch work had given him, and he wore it with the easy unconcern of a man who did not spend much time thinking about clothing. The minister, a circuit preacher named Reverend Holt who happened to be in Tucson that week, conducted a simple service. When he asked Calvin whether he would take Mae Harper as his wife, Calvin said yes with such immediate and unequivocal conviction that Daniel laughed, and Francis's older boy, who was 7 and had opinions about everything, said quite loudly that the man really seemed to mean it. Mae was laughing when Calvin kissed her. They drove back to the Double W the following morning, the two of them in the ranch wagon, Prudence tied to the tailgate because she was older now and did not like being ridden for long distances. The August desert was vast and gold around them, and Calvin kept Mae's hand in his on the seat between them for the entire 50 miles, only releasing it when he needed both hands for the reins on a steep section of the trail. They came to the limestone shelf 2 miles from the ranch. Calvin pulled the horses to a stop. He had, as promised, marked it. There was a cairn of white stones on the south side of the trail, waist high, visible from a good distance in both directions. Mae looked at it. She looked at Calvin. "You marked it," she said. "I told you I would," he said. She looked at the cairn, which was simple and permanent and had been placed there by a man who kept his word, and felt the full weight of a year press briefly through her. The fear and the road and the dark and the splintered wheel and the lantern light and the biscuits and Darwin on the table, and the gloves lined with rabbit fur and 60 days of counting, and the letter and his hands on her face, and the minister and Daniel laughing and Francis weeping very slightly and trying to hide it. "I am very glad I broke my wheel here," she said. Calvin looked at her with those twilight eyes and the full smile that changed the geometry of his face. "So am I," he said, "every day." He kissed her by the limestone shelf in the August desert heat, and then clicked the horses forward toward home. The first year of their marriage was the fullest year Mae had ever lived, not because every moment was profound, but because the ordinary moments had weight and texture and genuine presence in a way they never had before. She and Calvin worked the ranch together in the easy partnership they had established before the wedding, which meant the wedding changed less than one might expect in terms of daily structure, and changed everything in terms of the substance beneath it. The herd grew. By December of 1885, they had 63 head. The mixed Hereford Longhorn Cross Calvin had been developing, proving out in the way he had predicted. Animals that were stockier than pure Longhorns and significantly more heat-tolerant than pure Herefords. Mae documented the breeding outcomes with the same precision she brought to the financial records, and Calvin began to receive inquiries from other ranchers who had heard about the cross, which was a new and interesting revenue possibility that Mae set about developing methodically. Calvin's brother Daniel left Bisbee and came to the Double W in February of 1886 because the mines were becoming dangerous in a specific way, a labor dispute that was simmering towards something none of the workers wanted to see boil, and Calvin had offered him a share of the ranch work without needing to be asked twice. Daniel was 27, a good deal louder than his brother, with the same fundamental decency expressed through a more extroverted character, and he occupied the bunkhouse that had been Mae's first home on the property, and immediately became attached to the Double W with the fervor of someone who had not known they were looking for a home until they found one. Mae discovered in March of 1886 that she was expecting a child. She sat with this information for 2 days before telling Calvin, not from any reluctance to share it, but from the need to hold it privately for a moment first, to turn it over in the specific light of her own heart before it became something shared and acted upon. She had not been sure she wanted children, had not been able to imagine wanting them inside the cold construction of her marriage to Thomas, but here in this particular life. And with this particular person the information arrived as something she could only call joy, straightforward and clean. She told Calvin on a Tuesday evening in March at dinner, with the directness she had learned he preferred. "I am expecting a child," she said. "In September, I believe." Calvin set his fork down. He looked at her across the table with an expression she had not seen before, the previous record holder for most unguarded being the January afternoon by the fence, but this exceeded that by some distance. He looked like a man standing in front of something so large he could not yet get the whole of it into his vision. "Me," he said, "just her name. Nothing else for a moment." "Yes," she said, though he had not asked a question. He came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her in the careful, full, particular way he had for embracing her, one hand in her hair and one against her back, and she felt his chest expand with a breath that was also something else. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "Are you all right?" "Very well," she said. "Both of us, I believe, are very well." Daniel, who was coming in from the yard with his hat in his hand and excellent timing, stopped in the kitchen doorway, took in the scene, and said with great cheerfulness, "Am I interrupting something of importance?" "Go away, Daniel," Calvin said. "I am going," Daniel said, and went, and they could hear him laughing all the way across the yard to the bunkhouse. The summer of 1886 was hot even by Arizona standards, the kind of heat that sat heavy on the land from 8 in the morning until well after sunset. Mae continued working through June and July, refusing to be treated as fragile though accepting Calvin's increasingly creative attempts to reduce her physical workload without appearing to reduce it, which she found both endearing and faintly amusing. He rearranged the tasks between himself and Daniel so that anything requiring heavy lifting or rough riding was reliably handled by one of them, presented as simple efficiency, which she allowed him to believe she believed. She was not fragile. She was also not foolish. She let him take care of her in the ways that cost her nothing to accept. The baby came in early September. The Tohono O'odham community that Calvin had maintained his relationship with over the years included a woman named Maria, who was known across 3 counties as the most skilled midwife in the region, and Calvin had ridden to ask her personally in July, a visit that clearly moved the older woman, who had known him since he arrived in Arizona as a confused 24-year-old looking for water. Maria arrived 2 days before the baby came, which suggested either excellent timing or a knowledge of these matters that exceeded what Mae could easily explain. She was calm and precise and utterly competent, and when Mae was in the hard final hours of labor she spoke to her in a mixture of Spanish and English that was both entirely practical and genuinely comforting. The baby arrived at 2 in the morning, a boy, delivered into Maria's steady hands while Calvin paced the kitchen with an expression Daniel later described as a man experiencing all the emotions ever felt by a human being simultaneously. He was a son. Calvin held him with the terrified reverence of a man touching something more valuable than anything he had previously held, which was an accurate assessment. They named him James. James Whitfield, for Calvin's father, who had been the 4th man to stop. Mae watched Calvin hold James in the lamplight, this man who had driven out in the dark to fix her wagon, who had looked at her across a kitchen table with twilight eyes and offered her something entirely different from what she had escaped, and felt the overwhelming specific density of happiness that meant you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The 2 years that followed James's arrival at the Double W were years of accumulation. The herd reached 80 head, then 90. The breeding program for the mixed cattle attracted enough attention that Calvin and Mae formalized it as a secondary business, selling breeding stock at prices that reflected the genuine quality of the animals and the documentation Mae maintained on their lineage and performance. Daniel proved himself more than a capable worker, developing a particular gift for training horses that eventually became a small but profitable addition to the ranch's income. James Whitfield grew from a small, serious, dark-eyed infant into a small, serious, dark-eyed toddler who followed his father around the ranch with the focused intensity of someone who had decided that this was the most interesting place in the world and intended to understand everything about it. He had Calvin's eyes, the specific twilight color, and Me's precision, the way he arranged things neatly and looked at them carefully before touching. He called Calvin Pa and me Mama and Daniel by his full name, Daniel, with a gravity that the 29-year-old found hilarious. In the autumn of 1888, Me discovered she was expecting again. She told Calvin at dinner, as she had told him the first time, with the directness he preferred, and watched the same overwhelming expression cross his face, slightly more practiced this time but no less genuine. "Another September?" he asked. "May this time," she said. The second child, a daughter they named Rose after Me's mother, arrived in May of 1889, Maria again presiding with her excellent and inexplicable timing. Rose was nothing like James from the first moment, loud and definitive where her brother was quiet and studying, with Me's dark hair and Calvin's smile, the full one that changed the geometry of a face. By the time Rose was 6 months old, the Double W had grown to 112 head of cattle, 2 full-time hired hands in addition to Daniel, and a reputation in the territorial cattle market for the quality of both its stock and its business dealings. Me managed the accounts and the contracts and the breeding documentation from a proper office she had established in what had originally been a storage room off the kitchen, with a real desk and 2 proper file cabinets, and a window she had insisted on cutting, because she would not work in a room without natural light. Calvin had cut the window himself in an afternoon, whistling while he worked, and had framed it with care and fit it with glass ordered from Tucson, and had set a box of herbs on the sill because Me liked things growing near her when she worked. She caught him looking at the office sometimes with an expression that she had long since learned to read accurately. Satisfaction. A specific settled satisfaction, the kind that was not complacency but its better cousin, the knowledge that what you have built is good and that the person you built it with was the right choice. She looked at him with the same expression. Whenever she thought he was not watching, he was usually watching. In 1890, the territory of Arizona was still 5 years from statehood, but the roads were better than they had been, and the town of Benson, the nearest significant settlement, had grown considerably and now had, among other things, a proper schoolhouse. James, who was nearly 4, had been receiving his early education from Me at the ranch, as had been common for children in remote ranching families, but Me had begun corresponding with a teacher at the Benson school about the possibilities of enrollment when he was old enough. There was also, by 1890, a small library in Benson. Me had donated to it twice, books from her own collection, and a financial contribution that allowed the library to purchase several specific titles she recommended. The librarian, a woman named Helen Marsh, had written her a letter of such warm appreciation that they had begun a correspondence that eventually became genuine friendship. That summer, Calvin's mother made the journey from Texas to see the ranch and the grandchildren. She was 63, smaller than Me had imagined from Calvin's descriptions, with white hair and black eyes, and the particular authority of a woman who had outlasted a great deal of difficult country. She looked at the Double W with a rancher's assessing eye, walked the fence lines, looked at the herd, examined the accounts Me showed her with the sharp focus of someone who understood numbers, and then on her third evening told Me over dinner that she was very pleased with her son's choices, a statement that she directed at Me rather than Calvin, which made her meaning clear. Me thanked her and meant it. On the morning before Calvin's mother left, Me came into the kitchen to find the two of them at the table with coffee, the conversation quiet and clearly of some depth. She started to step back out, but Calvin's mother turned and said, "Come in, Me." I was telling Calvin about his father. She sat and listened to the older woman speak about the fourth man who stopped, the man who had waited for Calvin's mother to be ready and had been patient, because he understood that patience was itself a form of love. She talked about building the Texas ranch from nothing, about the bad years and the good ones, about what it meant to build something together. "The thing about the land," she said, looking out the kitchen window at the Sonoran Desert in its late summer brass, "is that it teaches you what you are made of. And the thing about love," she continued, "is that it does the same. And if you are lucky, what you learn about yourself from each one is the same answer." She looked at Calvin. She looked at me. "You have been lucky," she said. "Yes," Calvin said. "Yes," me said. The older woman nodded once, satisfied, and picked up her coffee. That September, me received a letter from George Hensley, who was now a judge in Santa Fe. He wrote to inform her that Thomas Aldridge had died in federal prison. A heart ailment, the prison physician's report said. Thomas had been 51. He had served 3 years of his sentence. Me sat with the letter for a long time. She did not grieve for Thomas specifically. She had processed whatever grief belonged to that relationship in the first weeks at Francis's house 5 years ago, but she felt the finality of it in a way that was its own particular weight. A chapter ended, sealed, completed in a way that no longer had any possibility of reopening. She told Calvin that evening. He listened without interrupting. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "It is strange. I thought I would feel more when I heard. But I think I have been finished with that part of my life for quite some time." "Since the bunkhouse?" he asked, a slight smile. "Perhaps since the limestone shelf," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had been reaching across this particular table for 4 years, and she held on to him with the easy certainty of someone who had learned exactly what their hands were for. In the spring of 1891, Daniel Whitfield fell in love. Her name was Clara Reyes, the daughter of a Mexican ranching family whose property bordered the Double W to the south. A 24-year-old woman with a quick mind and a quicker laugh who rode better than any of them, and had been managing the Reyes ranch accounts since she was 16. Me liked her immediately and completely, and told Calvin so on the night of Clara's first dinner at the ranch, which Calvin received with a smile and the words, "I know, I could see it in your face when she corrected my arithmetic." "She was right," me said. "She was absolutely right," Calvin agreed. "Daniel is not going to know what to do with her. He will figure it out," me said. "You did." The courtship between Daniel and Clara was considerably less restrained than the careful, measured months of Calvin and me, because Daniel had not been raised to be reserved, and Clara did not believe in wasting time. And they were engaged by August and married at the Reyes Rancho in October in a celebration that lasted 2 days and included the most food me had ever seen in one place. The Reyes family's land adjoining the Double W had practical implications that both families recognized and carefully did not mention for the first several weeks of the engagement. And then Clara and me had a direct conversation about it over coffee one Thursday morning, and had the outlines of a combined operation sketched on paper by the time their cups were empty, which they presented to Calvin and Daniel that evening. Daniel stared at the sketch for a long time. "You were waiting for us to stop being polite about it," he said. "We were being efficient," me said. "You were being tactful, which for me is essentially the same thing," Calvin said. He looked at the sketch. "This makes very good sense." He looked at me. "You are extraordinary, you know." "I am practical," she said. "Both things," he said. James Whitfield turned 5 in September of 1891 and began attending school in Benson with the serious, focused approach he applied to everything. He was, his teacher wrote to me in October, the most methodical 5-year-old she had ever taught, which was either a compliment or a gentle concern, and possibly both. Rose, who was 2 and in no way methodical, was developing the loud and specific opinions about the world that appeared to be her settled character, and which me found completely delightful and occasionally exhausting. The Double W, by the close of 1891, had grown to a combined operation of over 1,500 acres, with more than 140 head of cattle. The breeding program producing results that were being documented and would eventually form part of the regional record of successful crossbreeding in desert conditions. Mae's accounting practice had expanded, almost accidentally, to include consulting work for two other ranching families in the area who had heard about the quality of the Double W's financial management and asked if she might review their books. She charged them appropriately for the work, which surprised both of them, and did the work with the precision they had been hoping for, which surprised neither of them. On a Tuesday evening in December of 1891, Calvin found me at the desk in her office, working late on the year-end accounts, the lamp burning bright against the winter dark outside her window, the box of herbs on the sill gone brown with the season. He brought her coffee without being asked, which he had been doing for 6 years now, and which she had long since stopped pretending to expect anything but. He sat on the edge of the desk, the way he sometimes did when he came to talk at the end of a day, and watched her work for a moment. "Good year," he said. "Very good," she agreed, not looking up from the column of figures. "The breeding stock sales were up 30%. The Tucson contract held. The water claim is fully secured." She paused, made a small mark. "It was a very good year." "That is not specifically what I meant," Calvin said. She looked up. He was looking at her in the lamplight with those twilight eyes, with the settled, full expression she had been reading for 6 years and still found as clear as a bell. He meant the year. He also meant all the years. He also meant what they had made together, the accounts and the herd and the breeding records and the children, and the office with the window and Daniel and Clara, and the limestone shelf with the cairn of white stones. "I know," she said. She set down her pen and took his hand. She thought about a woman alone in the dark on an Arizona road, hands pressed over her mouth to keep the sob inside, looking at a shattered wheel and thinking she could not go any further. She thought about a lamp in a window that belonged to other people's lives. She thought about what it meant to find out you were wrong about that. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said. "Tell me. That first night. When you came to the door," he smiled. "You were the most self-contained, terrified person I had ever seen." "I was not terrified. Me. I was alarmed," she conceded. "You looked at me for a very long time without saying anything." "I was trying to understand what I was seeing," he said. "A woman alone at midnight who wanted to discuss the specific nature of wheel damage. I thought you were remarkable. You thought I was strange." "Both things," he said, with the easy certainty of a man quoting himself. "Always both things," she laughed. He pulled her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, above the calloused palm and the faint old marks from the lye soap at the Tucson laundry, the hands that held his and held the pen, and held the children, and held this life they had built from a broken wheel and a lamp in a window. Outside the window of the office, the December desert was quiet and cold and brilliant with stars, the same stars that had blazed indifferently over a woman alone on a road 2 years before tonight. They were not indifferent now, or perhaps they had never been. Perhaps the light was simply what the light was, and it had been there all along, waiting for the right window to shine through. The Double W Ranch stood in its acres. The herd slept in the winter dark. James was asleep in his room with his serious expression softened by sleep into something that was purely a small boy. Rose was asleep in her room with her emphatic opinions temporarily suspended. Daniel and Clara were at the Ray's rancho to the south, newly married and newly beginning. And Mae Harper, who was now Mae Whitfield and had been Mae Whitfield for more than 6 years, and felt the name fit her completely in a way no name had ever fit her before, sat in her office in the house she had helped build into what it was, holding the hand of the man who had driven out before dawn in the dark to fix her wagon, the man who had offered her something entirely different, the man who had waited with extraordinary patience and asked with extraordinary honesty and built with extraordinary care. "Come to bed," Calvin said. "The accounts will be here in the morning." "They will," she agreed. She set the ledger straight, capped the ink, turned down the lamp. She took his hand in the dark and let him lead her through the kitchen and down the hall. This house she knew in the dark by heart now, every creak of every board, the particular cold draft from the east window in winter, the smell of pine and leather, and the specific warm scent that was simply Calvin's house and hers. She was home. Not the Santa Fe house with its mahogany and its dinner parties and its performance of safety. Not the bunkhouse she had arrived at with 2 trunks and a tin box and more courage than certainty. Not Francis's spare room with its 6 weeks of reconstruction. This particular dark kitchen with its coffee pot and its clean floors and its copy of Darwin still on the table, even though she had finished it twice and given her opinion of it, and begun a prolonged friendly argument with Calvin about the implications that she suspected would continue for the rest of their lives. This hallway, this house, this man. She had broken a wagon wheel on a shelf of limestone in the Sonoran Desert in October of 1884, and she had been angry and frightened and thoroughly alone, and she had ridden 2 miles back down a dark road to a lamp in a window that turned out to be hers after all. She had just not known it yet. The years ahead of them would bring more than she knew to plan for. James would become the thoughtful, meticulous boy-turned-man who eventually read law in Tucson and came back to the Double W with a practice that served the ranching communities of the region and a quiet humor that had been his father's first and had become his own. Rose would become the loud, definitive, brilliant woman who eventually convinced her parents that a woman could run the cattle operation and make it grow, and proceeded to prove this with a thoroughness that silenced every doubt. Daniel and Clara would have 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, who grew up alongside James and rose in the particular way of children from neighboring properties who are family in every meaningful sense. The Double W would grow to 2,000 acres before the turn of the century, a name known across the territory, a reputation built on honesty and quality, and the careful documentation that Mae maintained with lifelong precision. And Calvin Whitfield, who had come from Texas at 24 with more courage than certainty, and had learned from a Tohono O'odham elder where the water was, and had put a bunch of dried wildflowers on a windowsill for a stranger who needed a room, and had driven out before dawn with a lantern and a box of tools, because he had never been able to be in a hurry when someone needed help, would sit at his kitchen table in his old age with Mae's hand in his, and the sound of grandchildren in the yard, and the Arizona sky as impossibly blue as it had ever been, and feel that he had understood the most important thing there was to understand. The 4th man stops. And sometimes the woman he stops for is the whole of it, the ranch and the herd and the years and the children and the life worth living. Sometimes she is every good thing you were trying to build, arrived at the door in the dark with calloused hands and careful eyes and a wagon wheel that needed fixing. Sometimes the limestone shelf that breaks the wheel is not a disaster. Sometimes it is the beginning of everything. Mae always said the mockingbird that started singing that first morning, the one she heard as the wheel repair was finishing and the stars were fading, she always said that was the moment. Not the coffee or the biscuits or the letter in May or the August wedding or any of the other specific moments, though those all had their weight. The mockingbird, the sky going from black to indigo to gray, the wheel that held. Calvin always said it was the moment she handed him the rim iron without being asked, anticipating the need correctly in the dark. They argued about this, gently and with great satisfaction for the rest of their lives. They were both right. They were always both right. The desert stretched its vast, beautiful, unconcerned miles in every direction, and the stars turned overhead on their ancient schedule, and the Double W stood in the creosote, and the saguaro and the red dust with its lamplight warm in the windows, and the people inside it were content in the specific deep way that means you have found the place and the life and the person that were yours all along. And the limestone shelf 2 miles east of the property line had its cairn of white stones, visible from a good distance in both directions, placed there by a man who kept his word. It was still there 50 years later. Local people knew it. Travelers were grateful for it. And if any of them wondered who had put it there and why, the answer was simple and true, and the kind of story that the desert kept in its long memory the way it kept everything that had happened in its sight. A wheel broke here. A man stopped. And that was where everything began.